You know, last Sunday we looked at the story of Jesus calling a most unlikely person to join his entourage. We was talking about Matthew, and as a tax collector, Matthew was understood to be a traitor to his people. He was someone who'd sold out to the Roman occupiers so he could get rich, taking advantage of his kinsmen. And yet Jesus not only invited him into his inner circle, but he faced down the Pharisees when they expressed their astonishment about the whole affair. They said, "How could you do such a thing?" And he says, "Well, the people who are sick need the doctor, not those who are healthy, and that's who I've come for." Today we're still in Matthew, but in the next chapter, chapter 10, and here Matthew tells us how Jesus, after assembling his group of learners and followers, he sends them out on what we might call a short-term missions trip of sorts. He sends them out in pairs to tell everyone who'd listen that not only was God's kingdom coming soon, but he also gave them some supernatural powers, like to back up their message, the ability to heal the sick and do other things. And I'm going to start reading from at verse 9 of Matthew chapter 10, and it's kind of in the middle of Jesus' instructions to them here, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context. So Matthew writes, Jesus said, "Don't take any money in your money belts, no gold, silver, or even copper coins. Don't carry a traveler's bag with a change of clothes and sandals or even a walking stick. Don't hesitate to accept hospitality because those who work deserve to be fed. Whenever you enter a city or village, search for a worthy person and stay in his home until you leave town. When you enter the home, give it your blessing. If it turns out to be a worthy home, let your blessing stand. If it is not, take back the blessing. If any household or town refuses to welcome you or listen to your message, shake its dust from your feet as you leave. I tell you the truth, the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah will be better off than such a town on the judgment day. Look, I am sending you out as sheep among wolves, so be as shrewd as snakes and as harmless as doves. But beware, for you will be handed over to the courts and will be flogged with whips in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell the rulers and other unbelievers about me. When you are arrested, don't worry about how to respond or what to say. God will give you the right words at the right time. For it is not you who will be speaking, it will be the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." Now, obviously, a lot of these instructions were only for this specific occasion. If, I'm traveling to preach somewhere, doing something or on some kind of a short-term missions trip, I've been on a few, I don't think that this enjoins me that Jesus is insisting here that I take no money with me, or no change of clothes, that I only walk, or that I go barefoot, or I go knocking door to door to looking for someone who will let me sleep on their couch. Frankly, that kind of scenario sounds like some nightmares I've had on occasion over the years. But in the paragraph that starts with verse 16, Jesus is clearly talking about a future time further out than just the next few days or weeks when he was sending the 12 out. He said, "You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers." Now, that describes some of what happened we read about in the book of Acts, the history book of the early church, but it doesn't happen in the Gospels. So it's usually been understood that Jesus was referencing a time in the future when his followers would be persecuted for their faith. This happened in the early years of the church history and the book of Acts recorded, and in some parts of the world, it's still happening yet today. So even though Jesus was talking to the 12 apostles here, and we are not them, some of his instructions here do probably apply to us. And specifically, I've always been curious about the two figures of speech Jesus uses when he likens people to animals here. He says that they were being sent out as sheep among wolves, and that he says we're to be as shrewd as snakes, but also as innocent as doves. Throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus using this metaphor of people being like sheep who are in need of guidance, the guidance and protection of a shepherd. In the run-up to today's passage, Matthew tells us in the very last paragraph of chapter 9 that Jesus was traveling through the towns and villages of a certain area, probably Galilee, And he was healing people, he was teaching people, crowds, he was doing his thing, probably feeding people, doing lots of things like that. And Matthew writes, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus paints this picture of people in that place and time being, spiritually lost, needing guidance, needing healing, needing wisdom. And then not long after that, he tells the 12 disciples that in a way, they're going out like sheep who are going to be hunted by wolves. So they need to be wary. The implication is they need to pay attention. They need to be careful. And historically, there have been times and places when this metaphor was very apt for Christian believers. For the first 300 years of the church's existence, being a Christian could be quite dangerous, and it was often fatal for the first several generations of Christians. And then in the 600s AD, when Islam came to be and came on the scene, Christianity was nearly wiped out in so many places. The country of Turkey, we think of it as a Muslim country. We support a missionary who lives there. That was the cradle of the early church, one of them. There was a lot of Paul's books were written to churches that were in what is now Turkey. That was a Christian area of the world in a lot of ways, and now it's not, So, and a lot of times Christians were put to the sword by the Muslim invaders. And over the centuries, there have been serious persecutions of followers of Jesus in many different countries, and in some nations yet today, especially nations in Africa, a lot of Christians are getting persecuted, even to death on a regular basis. And this is the kind of thing I think that Jesus was warning them against when he said, you're going to be out there and you're going to be like sheep who are being hunted by wolves. He was talking about very serious stuff, not being inconvenienced. But, the truth is, on this, it's Flag Day today, and I don't know where's really much of a celebration of that anywhere, except on the White House, south the lawn of the White House this afternoon, where there's going to be the MMA fights that I'm sure you're all going to go home and watch. But, this day and age, we are blessed to live in a place and a time when Christians are not persecuted for their faith. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk online, stuff about the so-called war on Christmas. You remember that? Some of you probably will. It was maybe 3 or 4 years ago when everybody was talking about it. People would get upset and they'd get offended when someone would wish them happy holidays, around between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Happy holidays. Oh, it's Merry Christmas, and that nonsense seems to no longer be the issue that some people thought it was, but I still see plenty of believers in this country claiming that they're being persecuted for their faith. And I got to tell you, I just don't buy it. I don't think it's really happening. I mean, granted, Christianity may have lost or be losing its place as sort of the default religion of Americans. But our faith is not rooted, it should not be rooted in our identity as Americans. Disagreement, when people saying, well, I disagree with the way you believe and the way you want to do things, that is not the same as persecution. And people asking difficult questions and challenging our faith does not mean that they are coming for us. Furthermore, if we were to tie our faith in Jesus to our patriotism and our nationality, then we run the risk of adopting a very un-Jesus-like attitude, one that says it's like us versus them, And the truth is, our family members, our co-workers, our neighbors and friends who don't yet know Jesus, they are not our enemies. But even if they were our enemies, remember what Jesus said about those who had positioned themselves as our enemies? He says, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If that's how we're supposed to think and do and towards our enemies, imagine how much more we're supposed to think and do towards people who might disagree with us a little bit. They are not our enemies. My grandmother went to be with Jesus back in 2013 at the age of 96. Her whole life was spent living in or near the tiny, and I mean tiny town of Endicott, Washington. I doubt anyone else in this room has ever even heard of that place, much less been through there. No takers, right? Okay. It's maybe a couple hundred people nowadays. It's practically a ghost town. But she lived there. She was a farmer's wife until they moved into the city when her husband got sick. And then she lived there until she died. And she watched the TV news out of the network affiliates in Spokane, Washington. And Spokane is a good-sized but smallish city, really. It's a nice place to live or to visit, if you ask me. My sister lives there. I've been to Spokane many, many times. Once tried to get a job in a church there. That didn't work out. But when Grandma watched the news from Spokane, all she saw was the bad news. She saw the news about, the drug bust that would happen, the random crime that reported occasionally, the drunken brawls at 2 o'clock in the morning in the bars, the domestic violence that would make the news, the car accidents, and occasionally there would be a murder, And she'd watch that, and then she'd worry herself sick over the fact that 2 of her sisters, her granddaughter, and 2 great-grandchildren lived there in Spokane. And she was like, there's so much bad stuff going on there. How can anyone ever live there? So forget about the idea of maybe going and living up there to be closer to family. Oh, she was not going to do that. Well, did that bad stuff happen in Spokane? Well, yes. It's a city of, 500,000 or more people. And of course, sometimes things like that happen. Was that the whole picture about Spokane, Washington? No. It wasn't. And there are a lot of people of faith, people who take their faith very seriously, who are watching the news, and I mean both literally watching the news and metaphorically taking in their image of the world, and they're only getting part of the story, the negative part. They see the extremists on every issue. They hear their over-the-top comments and their performative actions and the things they do to get reactions from people, and they come away thinking that we're in not just an us versus them kind of situation, but an us or them scenario. And they kind of adopt the mindset of, do unto others before they can do unto you, and then split. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. Yes, Jesus warned that sometimes Christians have been, are, and will be like defenseless sheep surrounded by hungry wolves. But that does not describe our circumstances today in this country, thank the Lord. There's a Wesleyan pastor in Idaho named Benjamin Kramer who's become, in certain circles, he's become fairly well known, and he's kind of controversial in the last few years. And I follow him on social media and stuff, and on many issues I find myself disagreeing with him. But on this issue, I believe he hit the nail right on the head. He wrote, "Beware of any Christian movement that acts as though the world is full of enemies to be destroyed rather than full of neighbors to be loved." As Paul wrote to his protege Timothy, "For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." So let's not be seeing wolves where there are none. We are not meant to live in fear. I mean, we have Jesus on our side, and that's supposed to mean something to us. Now, besides warning them about the wolves, Jesus also encouraged them and us, I think, to be as shrewd, or maybe wise, some translations say, as serpents or snakes and he said as harmless or as innocent as doves. Translations differ a bit, but there's really not any great mystery as to why some say serpents, some snakes, and some say shrewd and some wise. The meaning is essentially the same there. And the idea is that as we live in this world as followers of Christ, we are supposed to be innocent, honest, forthright, and interact with people without all sorts of intrigue and hidden agendas, In other words, we're not supposed to be sneaky or deceitful, but that doesn't mean that we're supposed to be naive or unaware about how things really are in the world, or even become cynical when we have to deal with people who are sneaky and deceitful. Back in those days, doves, just like now, they're considered harmless. In some ways, they're pests. We got them around here in town. And yet, they were also ritually clean animals according to the Old Testament law, and they were what could be offered at the temple by a very poor family that couldn't afford a lamb or something like that, or a calf. So that's how they were understood. They were pure animals, but they were harmless. And snakes were thought of as being clever or wise or wily animals in Jewish mythology. And I don't know if their wiliness is a literal fact. I doubt it, but they would have understood what Jesus meant when he said that we needed to be wise like snakes. You know, the truth is there are a lot of people in this world who would rather spend 3 hours trying to talk you out of something, trying to get something from you, whether it's cash or something else, then they would rather do that for 3 hours than work for 2 hours to receive 3 times the benefit, you know? When we lived in Gallup, New Mexico, we got all sorts of traffic off of I-40. It's a major east-west thoroughfare there. A lot of people traveling, and people came by all the time looking for help. And much of the time, they were really only financing their nomadic lifestyles by telling poor me stories to people who might feel bad enough for them to give them a little cash or maybe a voucher for some gas or some food. And the same story really in Newport, Highway 101, is traveled by a whole lot of people who seem to find themselves on the beautiful Oregon coast without jobs or homes or vehicles or something like that. And it's like, you're looking for a job on the coast. Well, you should have gone inland a little bit and traveled up I-5, up and down I-5, be better use. But it's so beautiful in Newport. What a great place to be homeless, you know. And I know for a fact that over the years I have been taken by people several times. You know, sometimes I'd find out afterwards that their sob story was entirely fictional. Other times I would never see them again, despite their solemn promise to return. Oh yeah, pay you back next week, next month. They wouldn't show up. But you know, many times I suspected that the story I was being told was more fiction than fact, but I reasoned that there was also a chance that it might be at least partially true, so I would offer what help I could. One time in New Mexico, I had a fellow come to me one day, and he told me he needed help getting out of town, moving. I don't know, I can't remember if he was going to the West Coast or back to the East Coast, but he was traveling. And he gave me a reference to call, and it was a church in Washington, D.C. I looked it up. It was the real deal. And so I called there, and I talked to the church secretary, and I said, this fellow's here, and he's needing some help. Do you know him? Yeah, we know him. I said, well, is he a decent sort of fellow? Well, he's a good-natured fellow, she said, but he's got a drinking problem. And he admitted it. I told him that. He goes, yeah. He said, that's true. That's fair. So I visited with him for a bit, and then I arranged for a bus ticket for him for the next day. And he had on these just really cheap loafers that were just not good for life on the road. And I had we wore the same size. He had big feet too. And I had this pair of light hiking boots that still had a lot of miles left on them. I liked those shoes, but I gave them to him because he needed those shoes. He needed something better on his feet than what he had there. And I got him a voucher. We had a system in town, secured a voucher for a motel room for the night, and enough money to buy dinner. You know, he could go to McDonald's or something like that. I can't remember if I got him a voucher for that or was cash from my pocket or the church's funds for that. But anyway, then I think I took him gave him a ride to where he was going to stay the night and sent him on his way. And I'm thinking I was done with that. Well, the next day, late morning, he shows up, and he looked like he'd been rode hard and put away wet. And he'd gotten drunk the night before. He had urinated on his bus ticket. He pulled it out of his pocket and says, here, look at this. I peed on it. I said, I don't want to touch that, you know. And then so he had then missed the bus because it was an early morning bus, and he said, Derek, I need your help. And I looked at him. I said, you told me you weren't going to drink last night. And you know what his reply was? I didn't get drunk on the money you gave me. He had other monies that he got drunk with. Friends, sometimes it's hard not to become cynical. It's hard not to default to always being suspicious of people, or worse, to always become constantly unfeeling and hard-hearted. Part of being innocent in the way that Jesus desires us to be is being able to fulfill our obligations to help, to love, and to serve, and realize that we cannot be responsible for how our gifts, whether it's money or some other manifestation of love or acts of service, we cannot be responsible for how they are received and used. I am responsible for my attitude, for how I use what the Lord has given me. and for how I treat others. How they receive it and what they do with the things I offer or give to them in the Lord's name, that is not my responsibility. And I decided a long time ago that I would rather be taken advantage of from time to time than risk becoming cold and cynical. Now, do I always succeed in this? Oh, no, not in the least. Probably 20 years ago, I somehow got crossways with a couple, a family, a small family in the church in Newport. And I'm not sure exactly where the strife started. I probably was insensitive a few times. That sometimes happens. But it became clear that they didn't think much of me and the other person that was on staff at the church at that time. And what made this especially difficult, stuff like this happens from time to time, sadly, is that they hosted a weekly study or fellowship time group at their home. And several of the core families from the church attended that and were part of that group. So then, I'm finding myself worrying about the seeds of discontentment that they might be sowing. I don't go to that group. What are they saying about me that I'm not there to rebut on the night they're doing that? So this situation festered for a while, but finally they kind of let it be known that they were done. They would not be attending, and they no longer considered themselves members of our church. And I was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, basically seeing if any of their home group were going to jump ship with them. And then about that time, I ran into someone from that group at Fred Meyer one day. And this man, Jim, was a good friend of mine. He's since gone to be with Jesus. Yet he was also close to the discontent couple. He was friends of theirs. He was part of that group that met at their home. So saw him at Fred Meyer. We visited a bit, mostly talking around the situation, but it finally came up, and he acknowledged that the whole business was troubling. But he was not one to gossip or anything like that, but he didn't give me any hint of whether or not he considered himself to be on either side of this business that was going on, the conflict here. And I'll tell you what, in that moment, I wanted so badly to plead my case to my friend. I wanted to tell him what a pain in the neck that this couple had been at times. How I'd helped them out on several occasions and I only got negativity from them in return. I wanted to point out that his and my history went way further back than his history with those other people, And I don't know what stopped me exactly from saying that, but that and more, but I kept my mouth shut. And I think that was the wiser choice. In the end, that couple did leave our church, but they took no one else with them. Sometimes, we equate innocence with ignorance, saying that being innocent is really about not knowing. Well, if you don't know, you can't tell a secret you don't know. You can't accuse someone of lying if you don't know the truth. That's a question I'm not going to ask because I don't want to know the answer to it. But the type of innocence that Jesus is talking about here implies that more than just choosing to not look, to go around with blinders on, or to be unobservant and to not see sometimes what's right in front of you. No, it's about choosing not to be manipulative, not to play mind games or word games with people, or to parse what the verb is means or anything like that, or to always make sure that you leave yourself out and have plausible deniability. Jesus' desire for us as his followers is to be smart, to be wise, to keep our eyes open, to pay attention. A friend of mine used to say, I was born at night, but not last night. And I thought that's a pretty good attitude to have. And that is being shrewd. However, he also wants us to resist the urge to play games with people, to always play it safe, choosing to see no evil just so we can avoid responsibility. And it's a delicate balance there. There's a tension there for sure. And it's a tough tension to hold. If we are shrewd, we know we might get burned on occasion. If we are innocent, we risk looking foolish. But Jesus does not call us to a life of safe, comfortable ignorance. He's called us to a life of clear-eyed obedience. And that's not always the easiest thing to maintain in our lives. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, as we have looked at your word this morning, and seen Christ's commandment for us to be both wise and innocent, to be observant and to give people the benefit of the doubt. Help us each as we grow in you to work on that balance, to be both as wise as the proverbial snake and as innocent as the proverbial dove. We ask that you would help us each mature in your Son, Jesus Christ, that you would send your Spirit upon us, that we would grow to be like your Son more and more each day. These things I ask for myself and for all of us here. In Jesus' name, amen.